All right, everyone, here is exactly what I promised, an in-depth look at a checklist. So this is a particular unit of biology. Of course, you can change this to be whatever unit or subject that you may need, but I wanted to give you a filled-in example so you would know where everything went when it looks all final-like. So first stop on our tour is at the top over here, the calendar. So really it's just like any other calendar. You would just insert a table, however big you need it to be, and then fill in the dates. So we're on A-B schedule, so you'll see we have A day and then B day. So these two boxes are the same. This happens to be when we start back in the spring semester, so there's a few more words in here because of logistical things that we had to take care of when we got back. But generally, there's a lot of numbers in these boxes because they correspond to activities that we're doing that day. So as you make your way through the calendar, it's really just like any other agenda, what you're doing that day, a nice little setup in a condensed form on top, because all of the actual activities are going to be listed down below. So whatever numbers you see, the kids would scroll down. They would have a live document of this, obviously, so they could scroll down and see whatever they need to do. So that brings us to part 2, which is the learning targets. I say this is part 2 because this is probably the hardest part of the checklist to set up, only because you're taking, in Texas, we're using TEKS. In other states, I know you use different standards, but you're taking those standards and breaking them down for students into I can or I know or whatever I statement that you can give them, which sets it up to be a nice study guide. So I can identify the parts of a nucleotide and explain the base pairing rule. If I was a student, I would be able to change that into a question, say, can I identify the parts of a nucleotide and explain the base pairing rule? And so going through all of the learning targets that you put in here should allow students to study and be able to say what they can or cannot do. So once you fill in all of the learning targets that you want for the unit, then you would move on to evidence of learning, which is this section over here on this side. So evidence of learning is just the activities that the students are going to do. So in your agenda that you have right now, whatever activities that you're going to do, you would just copy and paste those right into these boxes. They would just get organized into categories by learning target. So you'll see that I merged this whole box on the right here together so that I didn't have to try to separate like parts of a nucleotide is only this activity. That's not really accurate. And so you can definitely pick multiple learning targets to go with evidence of learning, or you can narrow it down. So for example, down here, I can explain the relationships. This learning target really only has one number over here under evidence of learning. So evidence of learning, a few things about this stop 3 that we've reached. Number 1, pretty simple. Number 2, so this is an order that a student can go through even if something happens this coming semester with COVID and you're not in front of them to explain what to do. It's pretty self-explanatory to just follow the numeric sequence. So number 1, number 2, where it gets a little confusing for students, that is just a quick explanation. When there is an A or a B, this is where I like to put in choice. So they only have to choose one number 3, but it gives them some choice. It also allows for some extra resources here. So for instance, in this example, 3A is a PowerPoint, 3B is a video. It's going to give them the same information, but maybe it's easier for some students to take notes via PowerPoint and some to do a video, or maybe a student wants to take the PowerPoint notes and then go watch the video to put it all together. So I really like allowing this choice, and you'll see that here throughout. So here and there, throwing in some choice, trying to make it a little more interactive for students to be able to choose how they're learning or how they want to show their learning, like with processing assignments or vocabulary type activities. So that's evidence. Again, you already have these things. It's just you're putting them next to a learning target so that, let's say that the student does ask, can I identify parts of a nucleotide and explain the base pairing rule? Well, maybe they can't. Now the nice thing is that they can go over here and they know that these are the things they should go back and look at in their interactive notebook, on their digital IMB, however you want them to actually complete these activities, but that's in there. Okay, so as far as the students go, here's this middle section where you see number 1, number 2. What number 1 is really pre-assess, number 2 is post-assess. I just can't fit those words all the time, so sometimes I just do 1, 2 because they're doing a before and after of what do they know. And so up here, right underneath the title, you'll see a legend for them to use. Number 1 being no clue, up to 5 being that they could teach others. So they should, when they first see this checklist for every unit, go through and under pre or number 1 column here, put how they feel about each one of the learning targets. Can you do this? Can you recognize this? Can you explain this? So 1 to 5, 1 to 5. Some things I know they've never seen before, so it should be straight 1s all the way down. Some things, especially biology, is very repetitive from 7th grade, and so a lot of things they have seen before, and so those are things I know that I can have them kind of practice on their own, and we don't have to spend a lot of time and can move on. After a few years, I figured out where kids usually are, and so it's a little more intuitive, but it's really nice, especially that first year, to see, oh, they know this stuff already, so we can move on, or at least go through it a lot faster. So that's how they would use that, and then obviously at the end, usually on review day, they would go through under number 2 and put in how they feel after we've gone through the whole unit and make sure that they've actually mastered all of these learning targets. Now, the cool thing about that is I also on review day, sometimes it's a goal, I like to have my students go ahead and do a study guide based on their own analysis of how they feel about each one of the learning targets. They have to do a minimum of, let's say, 3, depending on how many there are, but making sure that they are trying to actually write out the answer to these learning targets. So I'll pick another one to say, can I create, recognize, and label a cell cycle diagram? And then they would answer the question. I can create a cell cycle diagram and then actually have them create it. I can recognize the parts and then label the parts for themselves, and it turns into a nice little study tool for them to use. Not that they also don't have these right here that they can refer to complete that study guide, or sometimes, depending on time crunch, I have them copy and paste some of the things they've done to create a nice compact version. But lots of different things you could do with that. Obviously up to you. We're going to move on to the next part. Next part being learning checkpoints. So you can do as many or as few as you want, or you don't have to do them at all, and I'll show you a variation of this in just a second. So there's a learning check. I like to do pretty much one every day. It becomes their starter. So up here in the calendar, you'll see learning check number 1, LC number 2, LC number 3, and so on and so on. So all of these learning checks turns into starters. So you should have done, for example, again, number 1 and 2 in class, homework is number 3. So the next day, being here on Thursday, learning check number 1 happens. It covers number 1 through number 3 for exactly that reason. That should see everything again that they did last class. So whether they finish their homework will be shown and things like that. So I'm not actually checking homework. I'm not actually going through and looking at every single answer to all of these things, but there is a ownership piece to make sure that they are keeping on track with their work. The learning checks look like half content to see if they actually understand the content, regular test type questions, and then half of those learning checks come directly from the activities so that they have to show that they actually completed it. So what was the answer to number 5 on the POGIL Model 1 or activity number 1, however you want to put it in there? And so they would get to use their notes and their work in order to complete those learning checks. It is timed, so obviously it behooves them to have them in front of them open, ready to go and completed, because if they don't, then those are the ones that they are going to miss. So it's a nice check-in for not only completion, but for understanding, and a good way to, when the students are working independently, go and check in with the students that now you've seen who struggled with that content and maybe touch base a little more one-on-one with them. I love that about this setup. So I do learning checks on Canvas. I have another video about how students can log on to Canvas, but there is also a way that if you want to link here, so if you wanted to put in a little hyperlink and paste an actual Google form that you do the learning check on, that is another way to do it, and it keeps everything really concise on just this page. The only reason I use Canvas is because I really enjoy the timing features and the shuffling and the averaging for the grades that they do, because the way I grade is I take 1, 2, 3, and 4 on this example, and I would average all of those together and put it in for one grade in their grade book. But you could definitely do it as a grade for 1, a grade for 2. It just gets my grade book really busy, and so I don't like to do it that way, but definitely a way you could do it if you felt so inclined. Okay, so really quick recap. Agenda at the top, that's part 1. Part 2 would be learning targets. Part 3 to set up would be evidence of learning. Part quote unquote 4 would be the middle area here, that's what the students are actually doing the first thing when they get this paper, and then part 5 being the learning check-in areas. And then the very last part 6 here, is a vocabulary section that I include all the words that they may see come test or anything that is new that they should be reviewing. The other nice thing you could do with this vocabulary is you can put it into Quizlet and have students do some vocab as review, or they can make their own Quizlet or other review online thing to practice all this vocabulary. And then you'll see down here I have another part, but this one is kind of hit or miss on how much time I have and how much patience I might have left with my students at this point. But I do sometimes do a pre-assessment before the whole unit, seeing where the students are, and then they're keeping track of that, their learning check averages, and then their final test score, and then which learning targets from their test were most missed. So going back and highlighting which of the learning targets they actually missed the most on the test, because the way we do our tests is there's a mid-unit test and then there's an end-of-unit test. So it's always helpful to have all of the learning targets that you really need to review. Of course, we also have a STAR test in biology that would be helpful to put all of these checklists back together and know already what things those students need to work on because they've done that the whole year. That ends up being a really handy tool. Now, before I wrap up, I want to show you a modification that you can make. Instead of just learning checks, you can add stamps if you needed to keep track and make sure that students are actually completing their work. So the one I just showed you was my pre-AP or honors checklist that I know those students are going to be keeping up with their work. So for on-level, I have classes that really are not doing their work when they're supposed to be doing it in class, and so the only time they can get their stamp is at the end of class. I do not assign very much homework in these classes, and so they really should be finishing before they leave. So every day they get a stamp. If they don't get it that day, then too bad, so sad. I know that it was late, and they can turn it in for a late grade, but that would be at the end of the 6 weeks. That's just the way I do it. I also do learning checks because hopefully they did finish all their work the day before, so they got this stamp. And then for the learning check, it's still a starter to check in and make sure that they were understanding the content. I have learned from my mistakes in that I would link here a Google form, because using Canvas can be an extra step that just takes too much time from these students in this class. And so I would definitely link that Google form here and use a different format for them. And then at the bottom, same thing with the vocabulary, but I do also add in a review day stamp, again, just to make sure that they're doing something to review and keeping on task. So that stamp option is a great add-in for classes. I actually ended up adding a stamp category for some of my pre-P classes, just depending on the type of students that you have and how motivated they are in class. And then again, I have the score tracker on this one, but that is pretty much everything. So just to say my favorite part about this one more time that I know I said in my last video, these checklists are great for especially distance learning because they're going to be able to follow this numeric, okay, I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, and then I'm going to take a learning check. And it becomes very self-guided, that there isn't a whole lot of teacher direction on, you have to do these 2 activities today. You are going to set up what they need to do, but everything is on this one sheet. So all you have to do is post this to Google Classroom or Canvas or whatever website you might be using, Schoology, etc., and then the students can pretty much follow on their own. There's no due dates except for the fact that they need to finish their learning checks or complete their learning checks by whichever date you set. And then that's how I did the COVID in the spring, was your learning check is on X date, and then that's when they had to have those activities done by. So it made it really easy to set up because they knew which activities they had to do for that learning check. So if learning check 2 was due, they had to complete 4 and 5 before then. So yeah, worked out really well for me. I've loved this for years, and it just transferred really well into a COVID type distance learning situation. So I highly recommend it. I love it. If you don't love it, that's okay, but maybe it gave you an idea of how to set up something that you can use for this coming semester. If you have any questions or comments, please post below. Like my video if you enjoyed or would use this type format. And if you have any suggestions on how you would tweak it, I'd love to hear that too, just to see if there's something that we can organize to do this better. Everyone stay safe, stay positive, and good luck.